Waurika, Oklahoma, in the fall of 1996, was a quiet, mostly rural town, a place where the horizon stretched long and flat and where high school football and church dominated the social calendar. But beneath the surface of this small town stillness simmered secrets, teenage angst, and a collision course toward unthinkable violence. Heather Rich was just 16 years old, a pretty, spirited high school student whose life had recently started to unravel. A series of personal struggles had cast long shadows over her once bright future. Her behavior had begun to change dramatically. Once a cheerleader and a bright student, Heather had started skipping classes, drinking at school, and experimenting with drugs. More troubling still, she had begun cutting herself, leaving scars that hinted at pain she didn't know how to express. Things at home were far from peaceful. Heather's parents were concerned but unsure how to handle the shift in their daughter. On the night of October 2, 1996, an argument at home became the final straw. She walked out before midnight, without saying where she was going, and never came back. That night, Heather was set to go on a first date with 17-year-old Joshua Bagwell. Bagwell was well known in Waurika, not necessarily for the right reasons. Born into a wealthy family, he wore his privilege like a badge of honor. His money bought him friends, parties, and a kind of invincibility that no teenager should possess. He had no real respect for consequences, and his entitled behavior had already landed him in trouble with the law on more than one occasion. Bagwell wasn't alone that night. He was accompanied by two other local teens, 19-year-old Curtis Gambill and 17-year-old Randy Wood. Gambill, a high school dropout with a violent streak, seemed to be a volatile influence on everyone around him. He was known for his temper and for running with a rough crowd. Randy Wood, on the other hand, had a more polished image. He was a student, a football player, and on his way to becoming homecoming king. But behind the wholesome facade was a follower, a young man who craved approval and rarely thought for himself. The trio met up with Heather and soon began plying her with alcohol. Witnesses later said the plan was never innocent. From the moment Heather got into Bagwell's car, she was trapped. She was driven around rural Oklahoma roads, laughing and drinking, but the laughter didn't last long. As the alcohol dulled her senses, the tone of the night took a dark turn. At some point in the early hours of October 3, Heather Rich was sexually assaulted. She was barely conscious, too intoxicated to resist, too vulnerable to escape. What began as a night of rebellion turned into something far more sinister. But the horror wasn't over. After the assault, the boys loaded Heather's limp body into the car and drove across the state line into Montague County, Texas. It was there, beneath a desolate bridge over a shallow creek, that the decision was made: Heather would not be going home. With cold-blooded determination, she was shot 9 times. The bullets tore through her head, chest, and abdomen. Her body was dumped over the edge of the bridge like garbage, discarded in the dark. For 7 days, no one knew where she was. Her parents were frantic. Flyers were printed. Local television stations broadcast her photo. Volunteers searched fields and ditches. Heather had disappeared without a trace, and speculation ran wild. Had she run away? Was she hiding? Or had something far worse happened? On October 10, a rancher in Montague County noticed something in the water beneath the bridge, a body, tangled in the brush. Police were called, and soon the horrific truth was confirmed: it was Heather. Her remains were bloated from the water and riddled with bullets. Her identity was confirmed by dental records. This wasn't just a local matter anymore. The brutality of the murder and the cross-state nature of the crime meant that the investigation was turned over to multiple agencies. The Montague County Sheriff's Department, Jefferson County Police in Oklahoma, the Texas Rangers, and even the FBI joined forces. They had to move fast, before the trail went cold. Within days, investigators began piecing together the last hours of Heather Rich's life. Her social circle, especially her connection to Bagwell, was scrutinized. The local rumor mill churned out names, and tips poured in. Forensic evidence started to emerge: bullet casings near the crime scene, inconsistencies in witness stories, and a gun that would soon link Bagwell and Gambill to the murder. Then came the break police were waiting for. A tip led them to the weapon, a 9mm handgun that matched the bullets found in Heather's body. The gun was traced back to a burglary just days before the murder, and the fingerprints on it matched those of Curtis Gambill. That evidence was the crack that split the case wide open. On October 24, 1996, all 3 boys, Bagwell, Gambill, and Wood, were arrested and charged in connection with Heather's death. The public was stunned. 3 local teenagers, 2 of them still in high school, were now facing capital murder charges. The sense of betrayal in the community was profound. These weren't strangers. These were boys who had attended church, played sports, and shared classrooms with their future victim. The horror of Heather Rich's final hours was only just beginning to come into focus. And as investigators pushed deeper into the case, they uncovered a tangled web of shifting blame, broken promises, and desperate attempts to avoid the noose. After the arrests of Joshua Bagwell, Curtis Gambill, and Randy Wood on October 24, 1996, the quiet calm of Waurika was shattered. Residents struggled to comprehend how three boys from their own backyards could be accused of something so horrific. Parents clutched their children tighter. Teachers whispered in faculty rooms. Rumors and fear spread as the gravity of what had happened began to sink in. But as investigators moved closer to building their case, the facade of unity between the three boys quickly began to unravel. When questioned separately, Curtis Gambill and Randy Wood gave conflicting accounts of the night Heather Rich was killed. Each offered a version of the truth tailored to their own survival, but none of them told the full story. Meanwhile, Bagwell refused to speak. Shielded by silence, he invoked his right to remain quiet and waited for his attorneys to prepare a defense. Gambill, ever the volatile one, was the first to talk. In his statement to authorities, he portrayed himself as a reluctant participant, someone who had gone along with the plan but wasn't the one to pull the trigger. He claimed that Randy Wood had shot Heather. It was a shocking accusation. Wood had always been considered the more reserved of the three. His polite demeanor and standing as a future homecoming king made it hard for many to picture him committing such a heinous act. Yet Wood didn't stay silent either. Once he realized Gambill had already placed the blame on him, he turned on his co-defendants. In his own confession, Wood insisted that it was Bagwell and Gambill who orchestrated everything, while he simply stood by, too scared to intervene. He described Heather's condition, how intoxicated she had been, how powerless she was. His voice trembled as he recalled the sound of gunfire, the thud of her body hitting the water, and the dead silence that followed. Their statements tore open the case. Prosecutors now faced a unique challenge: 3 suspects, 3 different versions of events, and no direct witnesses beyond the perpetrators themselves. The evidence was strong, but not infallible. Forensic material linked Bagwell and Gambill to the murder weapon, and the casings recovered from the creek bed matched the gun found with Gambill. But without a solid narrative or clear chain of responsibility, convictions would be difficult, especially for capital murder. Montague County District Attorney Jack McGay had to make a strategic decision. He needed a conviction, but he also needed to ensure that justice for Heather wouldn't be overturned on appeal. So, he chose to try Curtis Gambill first. Gambill had admitted to being present at the murder scene and had named the shooter. If he testified against Bagwell, it would strengthen the case against the more well-connected defendant. In exchange for his cooperation, McGay made a controversial offer: he would take the death penalty off the table for Gambill. It was a risky deal, but one the DA believed was necessary to secure justice for the Rich family. Gambill accepted, agreeing to testify that Bagwell had been the mastermind and the killer. But when the time came, everything changed. Gambill stood before the court, eyes hard and expression unreadable. Under oath, he betrayed the agreement. Instead of pinning the murder on Bagwell, as promised, he claimed Randy Wood had fired the fatal shots. The courtroom erupted. Gasps filled the air. The prosecution was blindsided. Suddenly, their star witness had turned into a liability. This twist forced Randy Wood into an impossible corner. With Gambill throwing him under the bus, his own plea deal was at risk. He had been promised leniency for testifying against Bagwell, but now, with Gambill accusing him of being the shooter, any suggestion of favorable treatment could undermine his credibility in front of a jury. So Wood made a harrowing choice: he would testify without the safety net of a deal. By removing the appearance of a bargain, his testimony would carry more weight. He stood in court and detailed the events of that October night: the alcohol, the sexual assault, the decision to murder Heather, and the moment they chose to push her body off the bridge. He insisted Bagwell had the most to lose, that Bagwell had called the shots, and that Gambill had been the one who actually fired the gun. He placed himself in the car, a silent, terrified bystander who hadn't done enough to stop it. The jury listened, weighing the evidence against the tangled mess of testimonies. Bagwell's legal team painted him as a victim of betrayal, arguing that Wood and Gambill had concocted a story to save themselves. But forensic evidence told another story. Blood traces, gun residue, and the recovered shell casings tied Bagwell to the murder scene more securely than he was willing to admit. Despite his silence, his defense couldn't withstand the mountain of evidence and the betrayal of his friends. Bagwell was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. With Bagwell convicted, prosecutors turned their attention back to Randy Wood. Although his cooperation had helped solidify the case, the gravity of his involvement could not be ignored. The court had seen through his passive facade. While he may not have pulled the trigger, he was there. He had watched. He hadn't helped Heather. And for that, he too would face justice. When Wood stood trial, the jury listened again to his account, this time through the lens of self-preservation. The question wasn't just whether he had fired the weapon. It was whether his presence, his silence, and his failure to act made him equally responsible. The verdict was clear. Wood was also found guilty of capital murder. As for Gambill, the man who had pulled the trigger and betrayed his deal, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole until 2026. He would spend the rest of his youth, and likely a large part of his adulthood, behind bars. In just a matter of weeks, the entire case had transformed. What began as a tragic disappearance had become a web of betrayal, shifting allegiances, and crumbling lies. Yet justice, as imperfect as it sometimes is, had found a way forward. As the gavel fell in Joshua Bagwell's trial, sealing his fate with a life sentence, a haunting silence settled over the courtroom. The verdict confirmed what many had come to suspect: Heather Rich's murder wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, it was a premeditated execution driven by fear, selfishness, and cruelty. Still, justice was far from complete. One final chapter remained: the trial of Randy Wood. The public perception of Randy had shifted repeatedly since his arrest. Some saw him as a coward, a boy who stood by while his friend was murdered. Others viewed him as a frightened teen who had made a devastating mistake but ultimately did the right thing by testifying. The jury, however, wouldn't be guided by sympathy. Their task was to determine if Randy Wood was legally and morally culpable for the events that unfolded on October 2, 1996. Prosecutors acknowledged his cooperation but made one point abundantly clear: without Randy, Heather would still be alive. He had helped Bagwell and Gambill get her drunk. He had participated in her assault. And he had watched, silently, as she was taken to her death. Whether he pulled the trigger or not didn't change the fact that he was complicit at every step. In his defense, Wood's attorneys leaned heavily into his cooperation, portraying him as a remorseful young man who had been manipulated by stronger personalities. But the prosecution countered with a brutal question: if Wood had truly wanted to save Heather, why didn't he speak up sooner? Why didn't he warn her? Or tell police the truth before her body was found? It was a chilling dilemma: how much mercy should be extended to someone who waited to do the right thing until it was far too late? The jury deliberated for hours, weighing youth against responsibility, confession against silence. Ultimately, the verdict matched that of the others. Randy Wood was found guilty of capital murder. Like Bagwell and Gambill, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. With the legal process complete, Waurika attempted to heal, but the damage ran deep. The town had not just lost a daughter. It had lost its sense of innocence. Heather Rich had been a vibrant, complicated teenager. Like many kids her age, she was navigating trauma, searching for belonging, and occasionally making reckless choices. But she was not beyond help. Her story, tragically, became a cautionary tale about what happens when pain is met with silence instead of support. In the months after her murder, her family grappled with unimaginable grief. Heather's parents, Dwayne and Gail, became fierce advocates for youth mental health awareness. They began speaking at schools, urging parents and educators to take the warning signs of depression and self-harm seriously. They knew their daughter had been spiraling, and they wanted no other family to miss the chance to intervene. The crime also sparked intense public debate about the failings of the juvenile justice system. Bagwell and Wood were only 17 when they took part in the crime. Yet their sentences were as severe as if they'd been adults. Critics questioned whether life imprisonment without a realistic shot at rehabilitation was just, even in a case this severe. Others argued the sentences were more than fair. After all, Heather would never get a second chance. Curtis Gambill, who had initially agreed to testify for the state but then reneged, remains incarcerated in Texas. His eligibility for parole comes in 2026. According to prison records, he has shown little sign of remorse, and his disciplinary history suggests he has struggled with anger even behind bars. Those familiar with the case believe Gambill is unlikely to be released when his first parole hearing arrives. Bagwell, ever the silent one, has kept a low profile since his conviction. His wealth and status had once shielded him from consequences. In prison, they meant nothing. Guards described him as distant and uncommunicative. Fellow inmates reportedly gave him a wide berth. He will be eligible for parole in 2036. Wood, too, remains incarcerated in Texas. Though he once cooperated with prosecutors, he now faces the same fate as the others, decades in confinement before his first shot at release. Some who followed the case hope he continues to reflect on what he did and uses his time behind bars to educate others about the dangers of peer pressure and cowardice in the face of evil. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Heather Rich's murder isn't in the convictions or the headlines, it's in the quiet reminders of her life. Her friends still speak of her laugh, her love for horses, and her artistic streak. Her family keeps her memory alive through outreach and community work. And the town of Waurika, once stunned by the horror within its borders, has taken steps to provide more resources for troubled teens. Heather's death exposed the dark underbelly of teen culture, how wealth, popularity, and small-town dynamics can mask violence, how trauma can go unrecognized until it's too late, and how peer loyalty can become a shield for the worst kinds of crimes. Her story is not an easy one to hear, but it is necessary. It teaches us that monsters don't always come in the form of strangers lurking in the night. Sometimes, they wear varsity jackets, flash perfect smiles, and walk the same school halls as their victims. As we reflect on the case, one haunting truth remains: Heather Rich never got the future she deserved. Her killers may one day walk free, but the pain they caused will echo far beyond the prison walls. In the end, justice isn't just about verdicts. It's about memory. And Heather's name deserves to be remembered, not for how she died, but for the life that was stolen from her. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. For more content like this, please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel.